31st of December 2019, the WHO China Country Office was informed of a cluster of cases of a mysterious outbreak sourced to the Huanan seafood wholesale market. A WHO report from the 12th of January found that 41 cases had been reported, of which 7 people were severely ill, 6 had been discharged from hospital, and 1 was dead. All of these cases took place in Wuhan of the Hubei province. The cause was isolated to a novel coronavirus, nCoV, which would later be named Covid-19, Coronavirus Disease 2019. Signs and symptoms reported were mainly fever, with a few cases having difficulty breathing, and chest radiographs showing invasive pneumonic infiltrates in both lungs. 8 days later, on January 20th, 2020, the WHO confirmed that the virus could be spread via human-to-human transmission. They reported 139 new cases just in that 8-day timeframe. The MRC Center for Global Infectious Disease Analysis calculated that the actual number of cases might be 1,700, well above the WHO's reports. They were particularly concerned with the fact that by this point, 2 cases had been reported in Thailand and 1 case had been reported in Japan. The virus had begun to go global. 11 days after that, on the 31st of January, the very first case of COVID-19 was confirmed in Sweden. The case was isolated and contained, and the infected woman did not spread it to anyone. On the 26th of February, a man returning from Italy brought with him the second case. That man infected a close contact who tested positive on March the 2nd. 5 more people soon contracted the coronavirus. The Swedish Public Health Agency hosted a press conference in which they claimed that contact tracing was ongoing and that the risk of new cases coming through travel into Sweden was very high over the next few weeks, but they were confident that cases so far were only linked to travel and that there was no general spread of the infection through the community. Fast forward to today. According to the WHO's global dashboard, on the 18th of December 2020, there were 348,585 confirmed cases in Sweden, and 7,802 people had died. These numbers seem small at face value. Globally, 74.9 million have been infected, and 1.66 million have died. When the numbers are in the millions, what's a few thousand? A lot. A lot.
Nej, men det är väl helt enkelt att vi har jag anser vi har misslyckats. Vi är ändå det är stort antal som har avlidit helt enkelt, och det är ju fruktansvärt. Det är någonting som vi alla lider med, tror jag, att vi inte har kunnat hjälpa dem, och det är ju en ganska, ska inte säga, men det är tråkigt. Det är helt enkelt bara fruktansvärt tråkigt.
Sweden's COVID response, especially when compared to its neighbouring Scandinavian countries, has been shocking. Obviously the numbers are always changing, but as of the time of writing, the country has an infection rate of 34,516 infected people per 1 million and a death rate of 772 dead per 1 million. That is an infection rate that is 1.7 times that of Denmark, 4.5 times that of Norway, and 6 times that of Finland, and a death rate that is 4.5 times that of Denmark, 9 times that of Finland, and literally 10.5 times that of Norway. In fact, this infection rate is only 70% of that of the US, and the death rate is 85% that of the US, a country by now infamous for its botched COVID-19 response. Sweden is literally more comparable in numbers to the United States of America than any of its Scandinavian neighbours. The only EU states to even come close are most of them, actually. Sweden's numbers at face value seem pretty middle of the road. But hold on. This isn't getting the full picture, because this isn't taking into account population density. Population density is the measure of how many people occupy space on average, and it's the reason why, for example, New York seemed to be doing so much worse with COVID-19 than other places in the United States that took the virus less seriously. Everyone's packed in like sardines, so the ability for people to effectively social distance is diminished. So, let's account for population density. We use a simple formula. We take the population density of our given country and divide it by that of Sweden. We then divide the infection and death rates by the resulting number. Obviously, Sweden's numbers won't be adjusted, and this also doesn't always lower the numbers. Finland actually has a lower population density than Sweden, so their numbers are inflated. Obviously, this isn't taking into account a whole bunch of factors, but it does give you a much better idea of how well each country is actually doing in comparison to Sweden. And the results? Oh. Good job, Malta. Once you begin to take in the full scope of Sweden's COVID statistics, you realize that their situation is orders of magnitude the worst in the EU. And just for fun, let's repeat the calculations with the United States. Their population density is 34, so after adjusting the rates, we find out that their numbers are actually lower than Sweden's. Sweden, a country that has long been the darling of leftists worldwide, as an example of a place where socialized medicine provides better outcomes for the people. And yet, their response to COVID-19 has been statistically one of the worst in the entire world. Why is that? Sweden's public health strategy could be best described as laissez-faire. They took a very hands-off approach to dealing with COVID-19, enforcing very few restrictions and generally allowing people to proceed with business as usual. This response was guided by the Public Health Agency of Sweden, led by Johan Carlson. Another important figure is Anders Tegnell, the state epidemiologist of Sweden and the effective public face of Sweden's COVID-19 response. These people, and the Public Health Agency, were the ones who were ultimately the scientific source of the response. And there were policies, sure. On March 17th, Prime Minister Stefan Löfven announced that the government was recommending the closure of secondary schools, colleges, and all adult education. Soon after, public gatherings of over 50 were banned, and restaurants were restricted to table service only. There were no widespread lockdowns, like in neighbouring countries. At this point, the pandemic was nowhere near its global apex, and people still weren't sure how to deal with it. Sweden's response was atypical of European countries, but not without controversy. In fact, in March, an open letter was sent to the Swedish Parliament, signed by over 2,000 scientists, criticising the Swedish strategy. They demanded that the government impose much harsher restrictions to cut down on person-to-person contact and increase testing. One of the letter's signatories, Ola Kamp, stated that he believed that the goal of the Public Health Agency's response was to achieve herd immunity, an accusation which the agency had previously denied. Herd immunity is the point at which enough people have been infected and become immune that the virus is no longer able to find enough viable hosts to spread. Another signatory, Professor Sten Linnaeus, was also very critical of the government's response. It is clear that what has been done so far is insufficient, above all regarding the number of tests. To fight the epidemic, you have to test. The material presented by the public health authorities is weak, even embarrassing. On a scientific level, it is extremely thin. Obviously, the Public Health Agency did not agree. Tegnell claimed that we have the best material there is. We have support from the very best researchers, not least in Karolinska. The philosophy of the Swedish government's response has been confused, but it can be pieced together. The government has repeatedly described the pandemic as a marathon, not a sprint, and has placed a heavy emphasis on personal responsibility and individual action. Tegnell has been quoted as saying, "We are following the tradition that we have in Sweden and working very much with voluntary measures, very much with informing the public about the right thing to do." Prime Minister Stefan Löfven said, "We who are adults need to be exactly that, adults. No one is alone in this crisis, but each person has a heavy responsibility." The government's response here is designed with the concept of flattening the curve in mind. They don't want to crush the virus entirely through harsh restrictions and lockdowns, but rather slow the rate of spread so that it can pass through the population without too many people having it at once, thus avoiding a strain on the healthcare system. This functionally gives off the appearance of them trying to achieve herd immunity, despite their insistence to the contrary. But the government also seems to want to respect the public's free will, and as a result enforce very light restrictions. The Public Health Agency's strategy has a strong focus on personal responsibility and individual action, imagining a world in which everyone will act voluntarily for the benefit of everyone else, in which no one needs to be compelled to do anything, because as long as people have access to the right information and know the proper things to do, they will do it, and it will all be fine. By the end of March, Sweden had just under 4,000 confirmed cases total. Their closest neighbour, Norway, had about the same amount. Denmark was doing a little better at 2,500, and Finland was doing very well with only about 1,000 cases. But overall, none of them really stood out next to each other. July 2nd, 3 months down the line, and Denmark, Norway and Finland were all floating at about 10,000 cases total. All three of these countries had experienced some form of harsh lockdown, and all three of these countries had defeated the first wave. Sweden had 67,862 confirmed cases total by the time July 2nd rolled around. They did not defeat the first wave like their neighbours had. Instead, were entering their second month of summer, coming down from their, at the time, new case peak just a week before. On this day, July the 2nd, the Public Health Agency released a very illuminating video. The video, which primarily features Johan Carlson, was recorded on June the 12th, but uploaded to the Public Health Agency's YouTube channel on the second day of the next month. In the video, Carlson addresses the personal responsibility angle. He claims that,
and also we've had in Sweden a consensus to avoid a forced lockdown, penalties, etc., based on our tradition here.
As we've already discussed today, there has been far from a consensus within the Swedish scientific community to avoid a forced lockdown, but I digress. Later on in the video, Carlson says that
the general strategy is a strategy of shared responsibility.
As we've already examined, the strategy of shared responsibility seemed to be failing Sweden by this point. The video goes on to show that in this 3-month period, the severity of restrictions had not increased in any meaningful way. There are only 4 binding regulations listed in the video: a ban on visiting nursing homes, distance education for secondary schools and universities, a ban on gatherings of over 50, and that restaurants and cafes must enforce physical distancing at penalty of mandatory closure. 2 of those were introductory measures brought in March. In fact, the entire rest of the video is spent focusing on
recommendations and advice,
including recommending that people over 70 self-isolate, recommending that you stay home from work if you are sick,
and 2 more days after you get well,
recommending that you don't travel unnecessarily, recommending but not mandating that you work from home if you are able to. I am not misrepresenting this video. I will link it. You can watch it. In a lot of ways, it is actually worse than I've suggested. And on the day it was filmed, Sweden recorded its highest number of new cases, 1,437, a day which was not even the peak of the country's first wave. Yet, Carlson claims that his strategy has been a huge success. He proudly presents a graph which shows that ICU cases in Sweden and in Stockholm, an area particularly affected by the pandemic, have dropped since the beginning of April. And in fairness, he's right. COVID deaths peaked in Sweden on April the 10th, and they've steadily declined since then, even during the country's explosive second wave. What Carlson neglects to mention is the ICU cases in comparison with other countries. This study, by Stefan Juranek and Floris T. Zoutman, compares the ICU cases in Sweden to Norway and Denmark. And as you can see, the results do not look good for Sweden. In the video, Carlson also points out some inherent flaws in his own strategy that he just doesn't seem to care about. For example, he mentions that people like bus drivers and waiters, people who work in the service sector, are at much greater risk of contracting the virus due to the nature of their jobs forcing them to interact with many random people on a daily basis. The solution to a problem like this is obvious: rent forgiveness and a universal basic income during a mandatory lockdown period. Instead, Carlson is just fine for these people to be right in the line of fire, as much on the front lines as the paramedics and healthcare professionals who fight the virus day in and day out. And while all of this was happening, Anders Tegnell, state epidemiologist, was warning about the dangers of wearing masks. Seriously. Concerned at the possibility that widespread mask wearing would give the illusion that it was safe to travel on public transport, Anders Tegnell has been quoted as saying, "We see no point in wearing a face mask in Sweden, not even on public transport." After the first wave abated, there was a relatively calm period over the rest of the summer. But in late September, the cases began to pick up rapidly again, and the country exploded into a violent second wave, which has a severity that far exceeds the first one in terms of infection rate. The death rate is notably lower. The lower death rate is consistent with other countries and doesn't really seem to be the result of any special solution known only to Sweden. Sweden introduced some harsher recommendations involving mostly stuff that other countries have already legally enforced, like avoiding non-essential business, working from home. They also introduced some actual laws. They banned more than 8 people sitting together at restaurants, and they banned public events of more than 8, like theatres or sports games. As of recording, January the 12th, they have very recently introduced a law which allows them to do a lockdown. Which obviously in a pandemic like this, there's no such thing as too little too late. But seriously, what the fuck? Even so, Sweden has been hit much harder by their second wave than the other Scandinavian countries. I spoke to a person from Norway to get his perspective on these events, and what he had to say was very interesting.
From my perspective, the Swedes are morons. Stupid people that don't get that this is real, and it is indeed lethal. I have a little more faith in Sweden now, but I personally think it's too late. My circle has the same feelings.
Do you trust the Swedish public health authorities? Do you trust the Swedish people?
I do not trust the Swedish health authorities. Reason is because they were far too late to the party. A lot of people have suffered for their incompetence and selfishness. I do not trust the Swedish people, not as the situation is now, and I do think the problem lays with the government. People listen to their gov. When they don't take it seriously and let people die on their expense, there is no trust. It's manslaughter.
Part of me wondered if his opinions were informed by a very strong political ideology, like socialism or the like, so I asked him.
I'm not politically engaged at all. Yes, I bicker for fun, and I like to talk about certain stuff, but nah, I tend to stay out of politics. Reason being is that people tend to go out of their way to prove that they are right. And to be fair, politicians are selling garbage to garbage men. They tell you one thing, do another.
This kind of opinion is very similar to a lot of people that I know. The sense that the well has been poisoned is a very common one. I think it's fair to say that this guy probably represents the views of a large proportion of Norwegians.
This may sound selfish, but their problems are their problems. They have dug themselves this hole. It's their job to get them out of it. If they couldn't take their finger out of their ass and take it seriously when it was at its worst, then what can we then do? Nothing.
At the beginning of this video, I said that 7,802 people have died from COVID-19 in Sweden. In the time it took me to write to this point in the script, that number increased to 7,993. As of recording, that number is 9,667. 9,667 people. Every single one of them had a story. A family. People who cared about them and will miss them now that they're gone. How many lives were touched by just one of those 9,667 people? You know what most of those people didn't have? A job. 90% of the Swedish COVID death toll belonged to those who were above the age of 70 years old, and more than half died in special housing, nursing homes. From my research, this 90% rate doesn't stand out that much in comparison to other countries, but what does stand out is the nursing home rate. Sweden's fellow Scandinavian countries have not reported the same representation in death toll among nursing home residents, despite the fact that all these countries banned home care visits around the same time, late March, early April. There are surface reasons for this. Swedish care homes are much larger complexes that hold more people than their fellow countries' homes, meaning that one infected person has a greater ability to do damage in a care home. Additionally, many nursing homes have been short-staffed due to COVID-19, with many personnel staying home if they show signs and symptoms of COVID, or even choosing to come in anyway because they don't want the residents to be left without any attendance, increasing the likelihood of infecting the centre with the coronavirus. But it runs deeper than that. Swedish care homes have been undersupported and underfunded. Not only have they been short-staffed, but many care home staff have reported not having access to adequate protective gear. The Swedish Municipal Workers' Union, or Communal, Sweden's largest union for municipal employees, blames the working conditions for the death rates. Communal reported that, in March, 40% of staff in nursing homes in Stockholm were unskilled workers on short-term contracts with hourly wages and no job security, while 23% were temps. These are people who can't afford to take time off from work because they get paid by the hour, not by salary, and they can't risk losing their job, so they're going to come into work even if they're sick. Many of these people will be working multiple jobs, possibly within the same sector, just to make ends meet, so they'll be going from care home to care home, and when they get home, they'll probably be living in a cramped apartment with other people in similar wealth conditions. What's more, Communal filed a complaint with the Swedish Work Environmental Authority, where they claimed that in one nursing home, 27 of the 96 residents, 1/4, had died from COVID-19, and staff still had not been provided protective gear or offered testing. A woman whose mother died in that nursing home, Bjorn Brennan, claimed that her mother had died from neglect because the staff did not have time to take care of her, and an investigation from the Health and Social Care Inspectorate found that none of the country's 21 regions had taken what they considered to be adequate responsibility for the protection of infected aged care residents, and 20% of residents had not received an individual assessment from doctors. In April, Health Minister Lena Hallengren said, "We failed to protect our elderly. That's really serious and a failure for society as a whole. We have a lot to learn from this. We're not done with this pandemic yet." I don't want to make any presumptions, but perhaps part of the reason that Sweden is allowing this kind of spread and this kind of death is because the government views the elderly as expendable. Healthcare providers in Stockholm, the country's capital, were instructed by elected bodies to not provide treatment to the, quote, weakest of the population, and were actively barred from calling in a doctor if an elderly patient exhibited symptoms of COVID-19. And publicly, Anders Tegnell has repeatedly insisted that reaching herd immunity is not the goal of the Swedish strategy. But in August, Tegnell's emails leaked. In one email, he was quoted as saying, one point would be to keep schools open to reach herd immunity faster. When his Finnish counterpart, Mika Salminen, replied that the Finns had crunched the numbers and rejected the idea because, over time, the children are still going to spread the infection to other age groups. Finnish models suggested that closing schools would reduce the spread of the infection among the elderly by 10%. Tegnell's reply? 10% might be worth it. Sweden never closed their schools for under 16s. Families have even been fined for keeping their children home. Clearly, 10% was worth it. I was originally going to take this section to hone in on Tegnell and Carson and Lofen and figure out just why the hell they would do something like this. But the truth is, I think the answer is kind of obvious. Tegnell and Carson and the people beside them think they're so much smarter than the rest of the world, when in reality they're just stupid, and they're almost certainly acting with the economy in mind. I was going to find out why the public likes them so much, but they actually don't. Approval ratings were high throughout much of the first wave. Not anymore. I was going to find out why this kind of virus denialism is being propped up by this kind of government. The Swedish government is not predominantly right-wing like you would expect, but rather a milquetoast centrist coalition that even includes a progressive wing. But honestly, I just don't have the answer to that question. There are some deep factors here in play that I can't ascertain. But I did find one interesting point of focus, and here I will cut the government some slack. because they aren't the ones managing the nursing homes where we see this level of depravity. They're privatised. They aren't run by the government. They're run by capitalists. Sweden's municipalities and regions, SKR, found that every fourth municipal employee in the care of the elderly or disabled was a fixed-term employee, meaning they were only hired for a brief period of time before the time expires and they are let go. Every fifth municipal employee was being paid by the hour. We already discussed this. These people can't afford to take time off from work. But these are just average stats, and the numbers can be much higher. In 30 of Sweden's 290 municipalities, over 30% of employees were fixed term in November of 2019. And in Danderyd, 43% of employees were fixed term and 39% were being paid by the hour. And what's more, these numbers show in the infection rates. Stockholm is the city in Sweden with the highest rate of transmission of COVID-19 in nursing homes and overall, and it's also the city with the highest amount of temporary employees in elderly care. Of the 10 municipalities with the highest share of hourly employment, 9 are in Stockholm. In the same county, private providers contribute more than half of all elderly care, more than double the national average. For clarity, the county in Sweden with the highest rate of COVID-19 transmission in nursing homes is also the county with a disproportionately high amount of privatized elderly care. And when you compare to other countries, the pattern becomes even more clear. 21% of Swedish nursing homes are privatized, compared to just 10% of Norwegian ones, and Norway has had significantly less spread in nursing homes. Meanwhile, in Belgium, 61% of COVID deaths happened in nursing homes, and 22% of their nursing homes are privatized. See the pattern? In Sweden, the private sector employs staff of a lower average education level, has less staff per individual care patient, and has larger complexes overall. This is in direct contrast to the public sector. As the rush of deregulation has spread further and further across the Swedish healthcare system, access to important resources has also suffered. At the start of the pandemic, concerns were raised over the fact that there were not enough respirators to take care of the population, despite the fact that in the 1990s, less than 30 years ago, there was a cumulative number of 2,000 respirators in action and 2,000 in an emergency stockpile. In 2019, there were 570 total, of which none were backups. Sweden also has the lowest number of intensive care units per capita in all of Europe, only 5.8 ICUs per 100,000 people, not even half of Italy. To date, there have been 519,000 COVID cases in the country. And even before the pandemic, Sweden regularly experienced chronic shortages of life-saving medications, including over-the-counter medicines and medicines within hospitals. And none of this is to mention the fact that, though having a lower initial economic downturn than its neighbours, Sweden has had a slower economic recovery and it has unemployment levels that are yet to return to pre-COVID levels. It is beyond ironic that the massive death rate can be attributed to capitalist practices by corporations at the same time as the government champions traditionally conservative and capitalistic values. The deregulation of healthcare corresponds directly to their individualist approach to dealing with the pandemic and their apparent disdain for communal action. At the same time as Tegnell and Carlson told the Swedish people to take some personal responsibility, privatized nursing homes caused the deaths of thousands of elderly people, unable to control the circumstances that put them there. The free market murdered Swedish people. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the Swedish response has been marked by the people responsible admitting to failure. We failed to protect our elderly, the health minister said. Clearly, there is room for improvement in what we have done. And as Tegnell said, I think most people in the profession didn't see such a wave in front of them, the Prime Minister said. Except for, 2,000 scientists. In March.
Känner kungen med alla familjer?
Ja, självklart. Man känner mig alla, självklart. Det är svenska folket som har lidit kolossalt under svåra förhållanden. Tyvärr är det...
The truth is, the Swedish experiment was a disaster on another level. 10,000 people have died. Over 500,000 people have been infected. No other state in the EU has had such a disastrous response. The United States of America has not had such a disastrous response. Will Tegnell and Carlson and Loffen be held responsible for what they have done to the Swedish people? Who's to say? It's clear from their actions and their words that they do not care. Though I've titled this section The End, I don't think the coronavirus is going anywhere anytime soon, and I don't think we've seen the worst of it either. But hopefully, by the time we have seen the true worst of it, the Swedish authorities will have come to their senses and done what is right for their people. And if not, here's hoping they see some consequences for their actions.